Picture this. I'm on an oil rig in the middle of the ocean, working 14-hour shifts to save money for retirement on my grandfather's Montana land, the only wealth my family ever had. For 25 years, that land was my dream, my sanctuary, the one piece of my family legacy I refused to let slip away. 2 years later, I come home, expecting the familiar smell of pine and fresh dirt under my boots. What I find instead stops me cold: 98 houses, rows upon rows of perfectly manicured homes, planted right on my property. The HOA president pulls up in a white Lexus, hair perfect, heels clicking on the gravel, and tells me I'm the trespasser. $300 fine for walking on my own land. Her confidence is staggering, like she owns not just the development but the air itself. I look around at the streets, the fences, the children playing in what should have been my backyard, and I feel a mixture of rage and disbelief. How could someone just waltz onto my family land and build an entire development without me knowing? But here's the thing, she didn't know. She didn't know that buried in my grandfather Mercer Reeves' 1948 deed was a single sentence, just 17 words, that made every house she built completely illegal. I hadn't discovered it yet, but when I did, the consequences would make this white Lexus driving HOA president wish she had never been born. I stepped back, breathing in the Montana air, the heat of anger mixing with the sting of betrayal. My grandfather had always warned me, they'll try to take what isn't theirs. But the land remembers. The law remembers. You just have to know how to look. And I did. For the past 2 years, I have been working offshore, living in a metal box in the ocean, surviving 100 degrees heat, isolated from everything I loved. Every dollar I saved, every exhausting shift I endured, was for this moment, to return home and live on my family's land. And now, the plan seemed shattered by these smug, entitled people who thought wealth and power gave them ownership over history, over heritage, over my life. But anger can be a powerful teacher. As I walked the property line, I noticed the small details: a fence slightly off-center, a drainage ditch cutting through the middle of what was once my grandfather's old orchard, the tiny gap in the HOA's paperwork they clearly never noticed. Every mistake, every oversight, is a clue. I feel a spark, a strategy forming. I retreat to my grandfather's old study, the room frozen in time, the scent of cedar and dust thick in the air. I pull out his meticulously organized papers, the maps, the receipts, the legal documents he'd left behind. And there it is, the sentence. 17 words. Small, unassuming, but deadly. It states, no development of any kind shall occur on this land without the explicit consent of Mercer Reeves' heir. I smile quietly. They had built everything without consent. Every street, every home, every mailbox. Illegal. The weight of what I hold in my hands sinks in. This is not just a legal loophole. This is justice. This is a trap they walked into blindly, a trap I will use to reclaim what is mine. I lean back in the chair, imagining their faces when the law catches up to them. 40 years in prison is not impossible. But it won't just be about punishment, it will be about reclaiming my land, my legacy, my life. Before I dive in, I pause. This isn't a story about money, or revenge, or even the houses. It's about the land, my grandfather, and the unbroken chain of my family's legacy. And now, the game begins. The first few days back on the land were surreal. I walked the streets that were never meant to exist, watched families move in, kids playing in yards that had been mine. Every swing set, every mailbox, every flower bed felt like a small betrayal. But beneath the anger, a plan began to form, a slow, deliberate plan to turn their audacity into their downfall. I spent hours in my grandfather's study, poring over deeds, maps, and legal documents. Mercer Reeves had been meticulous, almost obsessive. Every corner of the property, every boundary line, every historical right-of-way was documented with precision. I traced each street, each lot, cross-referenced old county records, and noted every violation the HOA had made. There were plenty. They had been sloppy, arrogant in their assumption that wealth and influence would shield them. The most important piece of the puzzle was the sentence in my grandfather's 1948 deed: no development of any kind shall occur on this land without the explicit consent of Mercer Reeves' heir. Simple, elegant, and devastatingly powerful. I wasn't just going to reclaim my land, I was going to make them realize the weight of every illegal brick they'd laid. I began by documenting everything. Photographs of fences, foundations, utility lines, even the HOA president's luxurious Lexus parked on my property. Every image, every note, was another piece of ammunition. I contacted a trusted lawyer, someone who had dealt with corrupt developers and shady property disputes before. He nodded grimly when I explained the situation. "You've got more than a case," he said. "You've got a nuclear strike waiting to happen." But I wasn't ready to strike yet. This wasn't about anger, it was about strategy. The HOA president thought she had me intimidated with fines and threats, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. I decided to let them feel secure for a little while, to walk blind into the trap. I started small. I visited the development in disguise, asking questions, taking notes, watching their routines. I learned which neighbors were loyal to the HOA president, who could be swayed, and who might crack under pressure. Every conversation, every glance, every hesitation was a clue. They were careless, overconfident, and utterly unprepared for someone who understood both the law and the land itself. One night, I walked the property under the moonlight, the cool Montana air brushing my face. I traced the original survey lines my grandfather had drawn decades ago, now obscured by asphalt and fences. The thought struck me, they had built not just illegally, but arrogantly, ignoring the very foundation of ownership. Each misstep was a thread I could pull to unravel the entire development. I also noticed something crucial: the HOA president had left a single file cabinet unlocked in her office. It was small, seemingly insignificant, but it contained signed agreements, developer notes, and permits that contradicted the legal protections in my grandfather's deed. They thought secrecy and speed would protect them, but secrecy makes mistakes easier to find. I photographed everything, catalogued every document, and sent encrypted copies to my lawyer. By now, I was forming a detailed plan. I didn't just want them off my land, I wanted justice. I wanted the world to see that arrogance, greed, and entitlement have consequences. My grandfather had built more than a homestead, he had built a legacy, a shield strong enough to protect me if I was patient and meticulous. And patience was key. I watched them with the eyes of someone who understood the game better than they could imagine. Every late-night meeting, every careless signature, every assumption they made without consulting me, everything was a step closer to their collapse. For the first time since I returned, I felt a sense of calm. The rage was still there, simmering just below the surface, but it was now focused. I wasn't just a man wronged, I was the executor of justice, armed with decades-old legal power and the patience to see it through. The trap was set. And now, all that remained was to wait for them to stumble right into it. By now, I knew every inch of the development as if I had drawn it myself. Every street, every utility line, every corner of every lot, I had memorized it all. The HOA thought they were untouchable, that the fine print of my grandfather's 1948 deed was nothing more than an old relic. But I had a plan to turn that relic into a weapon. It started with subtle moves. I didn't confront the HOA president directly, at least, not yet. I wanted them to feel safe, comfortable in their illusion of control. Every visit I made was casual, almost accidental. I would stop by, pretend to check on the land, nod politely to neighbors, ask innocuous questions. And all the while, I was planting seeds of doubt. A conversation here, a question there, hints that maybe the development wasn't as flawless as the HOA claimed. I also contacted a local journalist under the guise of being a concerned neighbor. A few carefully worded emails later, an article was published highlighting potential legal discrepancies in recent developments. I didn't mention the HOA by name, yet, but the gossip spread like wildfire. The HOA president began to worry. I could see it in the way she walked a little faster, glanced nervously at mailboxes, and checked her office files obsessively. The first cracks were appearing. But the real leverage came from the documents I had found. Every permit the HOA claimed to have was missing one critical signature, mine. Every development plan, every inspection report, every approval had been obtained without consulting me, the rightful heir. The moment I presented those documents in court, or even hinted at them privately, they would realize the full extent of their error. I began leaving subtle reminders on the property. A note tucked under a mailbox, a copy of an old survey map on a door handle, just enough for them to notice but not enough to be traced back to me. The goal wasn't confrontation yet, it was anxiety. I wanted them second-guessing every decision, doubting every step they had taken since building on my land. And it worked. One morning, I received an email from the HOA president. The tone was clipped, tense. She requested an urgent meeting regarding potential land disputes. My heart raced, not with fear, but anticipation. She had finally noticed the storm brewing beneath the calm surface. The meeting was set in her office. I arrived late, casually leaning against the doorframe, smiling. Her face was tight, eyes darting, fingers drumming nervously on the desk. "Mr. Reeves," she began, we need to discuss," I interrupted, calm, almost conversational. "Discuss what, exactly? The 98 homes built without my consent? Or perhaps the $300 fine you issued for walking on my own land?" She faltered. Her composure cracked like glass. I handed her a copy of the deed, highlighting the 17-word sentence that made every home illegal. She stared, frozen, as the weight of reality settled over her like a storm cloud. The neighbors outside would later whisper that the HOA president had never looked so small, so human, so utterly unprepared. From there, the trap tightened. I didn't need to threaten, yell, or coerce. The law itself was my weapon, and every sloppy decision they had made served as ammunition. I began contacting individual homeowners discreetly, explaining their rights and my grandfather's deed. Some were shocked, others angry, but most were terrified. They didn't want to live illegally. The HOA president was now isolated, under pressure from both the law and her own community. As I left her office that day, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and anticipation. The real work was just beginning, but the first step had been taken. The first seed of fear had been planted, and it would grow into a wildfire that could consume the entire HOA. The pieces were moving, the trap was set, and soon, very soon, they would realize the magnitude of the mistake they had made. I wasn't just reclaiming land, I was orchestrating justice with precision. And now, the waiting game had begun. Every decision they made, every step they took, would only tighten the noose around their necks. It didn't take long for the dominoes to start falling. Once the HOA president saw the deed, once homeowners learned they had been living illegally, panic spread through the development like wildfire. I watched from the sidelines, careful not to reveal too much too soon. This wasn't about anger, it was about precision. Every move had to count. The first signs came quietly. Contractors who had been working for the HOA suddenly stopped returning calls. Permits were questioned. Neighbors came to me privately, asking what they should do. Fear had taken hold, and it was beautiful to watch, because it was the fear of accountability, the fear of realizing they had built everything on someone else's property. I started contacting lawyers on behalf of homeowners, giving them discreet guidance, explaining the implications of my grandfather's deed. The HOA president tried to rally support, sending letters, threatening fines, even attempting to intimidate residents, but her credibility was gone. Every attempt she made to regain control backfired, feeding the growing panic. One evening, I returned to the property and noticed her car parked in the middle of the street, lights off, engine running. She was meeting a group of board members outside, whispering, looking over her shoulder constantly. I watched from a distance as she finally realized the magnitude of what she had done. 40 years in prison wasn't just a number anymore, it was a real possibility. Then came the first confrontation. A homeowner knocked on her office door, holding a copy of the deed I had provided them. "We need answers," they said. "Because as far as I can tell, you've been illegally running this development for years." Her face went pale, and I could almost hear the gears turning in her head as she realized the noose tightening around her neck. I didn't need to speak. The law spoke for itself. Every improperly obtained permit, every signed document without my consent, every single house built on my land, they were all traps she had walked into blindly. And she had walked in with the confidence of someone untouchable. Now, she was cornered, desperate, and alone. I began documenting everything meticulously, building a case so airtight that even the most aggressive HOA lawyers couldn't find a single loophole. I sent copies to local authorities, county offices, and, quietly, to reporters. Rumors began spreading. Headlines hinted at an unprecedented legal battle over a Montana development. The president's world, once perfectly controlled, was crumbling brick by brick. Late one night, I walked past the development, watching lights flicker on and off as panic spread among homeowners and staff. Some packed boxes. Others argued loudly. And somewhere inside her office, the HOA president sat alone, realizing that her arrogance had set her on a collision course with justice. I allowed myself a small smile. My grandfather had built more than a home, he had built a legacy, a trap, and a shield. All I had to do was follow the map he left behind. I had been patient, careful, and precise, and now the trap was springing. But the final act had yet to come. The moment when the HOA would fully comprehend the weight of their mistakes, when the law would step in, and when the houses they had spent millions building would finally, and legally, belong to me. That moment was coming, and nothing could stop it. As I turned to leave, I whispered under my breath, "Justice always has its day. And today, it's mine." The day arrived quietly, almost unremarkably. I drove up the long dirt road to my property, the wind carrying the scent of pine and dirt, the same scent I remembered from my childhood. But today, the air was charged with anticipation. The HOA didn't know it yet, but the final act was about to unfold. I had spent months preparing every piece of evidence, every document, every photograph. I had spoken to lawyers, county officials, and reporters. The legal groundwork was airtight. The 98 homes, every street, every utility line, every mailbox built without my consent, they were all now illegal. The HOA president, once so confident, was now isolated and terrified. I arrived at the HOA office early, before the staff, before the residents. The front door was locked, but inside, chaos awaited. Phone lines were buzzing, emails were piling up, and the president's voice, once commanding, always sure, was shaking over speakerphone. Authorities had arrived quietly overnight. Notices had been delivered. Every document she had thought concealed was now in the hands of the law. The first homeowners arrived, some cautiously, some angrily, realizing the truth. Their whispers turned into questions, and their questions demanded answers. The HOA president tried to assert control, but her words fell flat. Legal papers were served. Permits were nullified. Every home built without consent was now under scrutiny. The trap had been sprung. I walked into the office, calm, collected, every step deliberate. She looked up, eyes wide, mouth opening and closing like she was searching for words that wouldn't come. I held out the deed, the same 17-word sentence that had guided my grandfather's legacy and now sealed her fate. "You built 98 homes on my land," I said evenly. "Every one of them without consent. And every single one is illegal." Her hands trembled. The room fell silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Board members and staff exchanged glances, realizing their world had shifted irrevocably. The law had arrived. Within hours, county officials were on site, reviewing the development. Contractors were halted, permits revoked, and inspections began. The realization hit the HOA president like a freight train. She faced serious legal consequences, years in prison, fines, and the collapse of the empire she had built on stolen land. And then, the moment of personal triumph. I walked through the development, not with anger this time, but with quiet satisfaction. Homeowners watched in awe and fear as I marked boundaries, reminded them of property lines, and explained what was legal and what wasn't. Every home, every street, every foundation now officially belonged to me. My grandfather's land had been defended, not by force, but by patience, intelligence, and law. The HOA president tried one last desperate plea, but the law, the community, and the evidence were all against her. She realized, finally, that arrogance had consequences. Every decision she had made without my consent had been a step closer to her downfall, and now the inevitable had arrived. Standing on what was once my grandfather's orchard, now framed by 98 homes that had almost been lost to greed, I felt a strange mix of triumph and melancholy. This land carried the weight of generations, and now, justice had been done. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The land itself had vindicated me. I looked out over the rows of houses, the streets, and the trees, remembering my grandfather's words, "The land remembers. The law remembers." And today, it had remembered for both of us. The HOA president faced the consequences she had ignored for so long. The residents understood the truth. And I, Dalton Reeves, reclaimed my family's legacy, stronger and wiser than ever. The sun set over Montana that evening, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. I breathed in the crisp air, feeling peace for the first time in years. My grandfather's land was mine again, not just in title, but in spirit. The trap had worked, justice had been served, and the land finally rested under the hands of its rightful heir.